Welcome to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast, hosted by Alison Humphreys. The Recruitment Leadership Podcast is here to help those in the recruitment industry gain awareness and understanding on the hot topics faced by those in the business of hiring people. In each episode, Alison Humphreys is joined by a fellow expert to offer professional knowledge, insight and advice on the biggest subjects affecting recruitment businesses. It's the podcast to listen to for recruitment business frontrunners seeking expert information from industry-leading advisors. Welcome to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Recruitment Leadership Podcast. I'm Alison Humphreys and I am honoured to be joined on this episode by Neil Carberry, who is CEO of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. Hello, Neil, and welcome.
Hello, Alison. I'm honoured to have the invite to come and join you.
I know
keep
this
flattering.
Is keep flattering me.
Early adopter recruitment podcast, and I'm really pleased to come and chew the fat a little bit with you about where we are.
Thank you. Well, as any regular listeners know, there is nothing I like better than to chew the fat about recruitment, the industry. Now, for anyone who doesn't know Neil's background, it's quite phenomenal. He was for 5 years a recruiter, but he's followed that up with becoming MD of the Confederation of British Industry, a commissioner on the Low Pay Commission, and a council member at ACAS, which is pretty impressive. And that, of course, has led to him having a perfect mix of experiences to become CEO at the REC. But Neil, we do have some listeners, it's just possible, who may not have heard of you and even may not have heard of the REC. Would you just share with them what your role and responsibilities are in the REC and the wider industry?
Absolutely, Alison. I'll say the one thing I always say is my career before joining the REC was boot camp for running the REC. 5 years as a recruiter and then 14 years at a membership organisation looking after complex businesses, focusing on employment particularly. So, I kind of feel like the REC is my destined home. The REC is the UK's trade and professional body for recruiters. Listeners who aren't in the UK might recognise the American Staffing Association or organisations like the RCSA in Australia or Please Employ in France. Very similar national federation looking at protecting and enhancing what we do as recruitment, staffing and talent companies.
And you are one of the people who has, one of the very few, who has probably spent as much time, or if not more time, in government offices over the last few months than in your own office. So that kind of first-hand experience, I know, is of huge interest to our listeners. And I wonder, we're here today specifically to talk about the new Employment Rights Bill and the wider Make Work Pay plan from the new government. I think what a lot of people don't understand and would really appreciate your help on is, can you describe the process by which something as big as the Employment Rights Bill becomes regulation?
Yeah, I think it's a really good place to start. So you've got a governing party, Labour, elected big majority back in July. They have a series of commitments in their manifesto. And even before the manifesto, trade unions, business groups, groups like the REC were feeding into that process, talking to people about that process. We published our manifesto back in January, which proved to be quite prescient considering no one was expecting a July election, but it meant we fed that into, for instance, the Labour Party's National Policy Forum, which set the manifesto. They've been elected now. They've got a manifesto. That manifesto has some pretty clear commitments in it, but those are just headlines. So the law, of course, and compliance in recruitment happens in details. It happens in the weeds. It happens in the 50-50 decision you have to make in how you take things forward. So there's always a long process. This week, what we've seen is that they brought forward a bill. That bill has 28 measures in it. Those 28 measures are largely the things that they were in their manifesto. But what's really clear when you look at them is there's actually not very much in the bill about those 28 measures. So they've consulted with us and with other voices, businesses, unions, and others over the summer. We've got in to see the Secretary of State for Business, the Deputy Prime Minister, and so forth about all of this. But if you look at, for instance, day one unfair dismissal rights, the bill says we'll introduce some form of unfair dismissal for people in the probation period for the first 9 months. Doesn't really tell you what that is, because that will happen in what we call secondary legislation. So the way to think about the timescale from here is the bill was introduced in October. It probably gets royal assent in the summer of next year, perhaps. That is what enables the government to introduce the rules, but it doesn't set out all the rules. That happens in the regulations, which are consulted on in the summer of next year and are then laid in Parliament perhaps in the autumn of next year or into the spring of 2026, which is why one of the things I was really keen to get out when the bill was launched was, remember that nothing that's coming down the track, or hardly anything in the bill, happens before 2026. We know day one unfair dismissal, for instance, is likely to happen from the 1st of October 2026. That serves two purposes. On the one hand, if you're a recruiter and you've got clients who say, I don't know if I should hire because I'm worried about this day one unfair dismissal thing. Well, people you hire today will get unfair dismissal rights 11 days after people who get day one unfair dismissal rights when it's introduced. There is no reason for clients to be using this as an excuse not to take action now. And it's actually really important, as we as recruiters are the specialists in this stuff, and we can advise clients and calm them, especially after a year like this, we're trying to boost the market up. But the second bit is it gives us lots of chances to then have really detailed conversations. And my experience as a business lobbyist going back over 20 years now, which makes me kind of feel old, is that governments will always get the headline. They've been elected on it. But how that headline happens, it's like chalk and cheese. You can have things that are delivered really well. The national minimum wage would be an example of that back in the 90s and the 2000s. And things that are delivered really badly. The apprenticeship levy is a terrible example of that. So I think that process, and this is where we focus, that process of the next couple of years to make sure that when it lands inside recruiters' businesses, it feels like that's actually a really good thing to treat workers well, and I can comply with that easily. And by the way, the enforcement means that those who are not complying will get a proper stick, because of course in recruitment what we always worry about is being undercut by people who don't play by the rules.
Yes, absolutely right. So I think that will be really reassuring for our listeners to hear about the timeline. And the point you make is so important. Recruiters need to know this detail, don't they? Because their hiring managers and some HR people will hear a headline and it will have an impact on their actions right now. And so we've got to be in a position where we can explain the facts to them going forward. I have a question for you that somebody put to me. Does government really listen to organisations like the REC? And if so, why?
So that's a really good question. And I think it comes with a caveat. And the caveat is that bad lobbyists take what their members say they want and go and shout it at the government through a megaphone and expect to win. So the first thing I would say is let's remember that what is happening, what the REC and other bodies are doing, is a conversation between business and government. And we have to exist. Sector bodies, overarching economic-wide bodies have to exist, because there's no way government can consult with 6 million businesses, and 6 million businesses don't have the time to consult with government. We've got lots of placements to fill, hopefully in 2025. That's what our recruiters should be doing. One call with us and us doing the work on agglomerating is really important. Where that leads us is facing back to recruiters, the people who pay our wages. We have to tell recruiters what they can have, not just reflect what they want. So again, day one unfair dismissal is a great example. What would I do? I'd leave it at 2 years. At most, I'd move it back down to the old 1 year. But they've made a commitment. Now the question is, how do we make that commitment work? So often the discussion with members is, what if this or that? what works better for you. And it's in that trade-off and that discussion that government really does listen to bodies like the REC. I've seen the Secretary of State for Business probably 4 times in the last 2 months. I've seen the Deputy Prime Minister twice, seen ministers. They don't have those meetings if they're not listening. I've worked with governments who aren't listening. They don't see you. The challenge is then identifying what the red lines are. And in those who saw my comments on the bill when it came out would say I talked about this is fine, but we haven't got to brass tacks yet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's when we get to brass tacks that it really matters. So what have I said to government? And they've got this. Okay, if you're going to have a statutory probation period, great, 9 months, great, that's a win. Okay, it's not day one. You still have a right to unfair dismissal protection in that statutory probation period, just not the same as after the 9 months. Okay, now what is that? What does that look like? So case in point, I've said any process that is in a probation period, if an employer follows it, if an agency follows it, at the end, they should have a statutory defence. So you don't wait a year to go to employment tribunal. I have ticked the boxes that were set out. I have done the right thing in the probation period. There is no claim here. Likewise, you'll see in the announcement of the bill, there's a separate consultation on the effect of 0 hours changes on agency. That is there because of the REC.
Right.
So the way to think about our influence is we say, oh, the government has a mandate. It's going to do things. We need to persuade them to do the things that will help them achieve their goal and protect our members' businesses. That does make it messy. It is a negotiation. It means we never get everything that we want. But in terms of listening, absolutely they do. We've got huge amounts of time. And especially, I have to say, the one thing that I'd really praise this government for is they have put together a team of excellent civil servants. They've trebled the size of the team that works on this. And we're finding that working with those civil servants is really important. Now, I'm going to let you into a little secret here, which I'm not supposed to let slip. Sometimes what happens is civil servants say to us, Neil, Kate, Charles, we're trying to talk to the minister about this concern, which we know you share. Would you mind saying this to the minister when you see them?
Right.
So that's the nature of the discussion. It's very much a what if discussion. What if we did it this way? What if we did it that way? It's very involved, but you see the fingerprints of the sector bodies, in particular in the document from last week, in terms of how agency workers are dealt with. Hard work, but if a government is acting with goodwill, and I think this one is genuinely wants business and unions at the table, then there's a lot you can get through.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that, Neil. We'll just keep it between ourselves and our 1,000 listeners, shall we? That is an eye-opener, because I think in a lot of people's heads, although this isn't rational, they're thinking that the minister whose name is attached to a bill has somehow become an expert, or thinks they've become an expert in that area overnight. Well, they can't possibly be across the detail of everything they're meant to be doing. They've only been in office, as you say, since July. And just the detail of how things actually work in business, or how temporary work works, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They do need to have it explained to them, don't they? Now, we're not going to repeat the content here, because there's been plenty written about it and people can Google that. But I think for most people that I work with, the weightiest proposed changes are sort of generally reckoned to be the number one, the single worker status. Number two, the right to switch off. Number three, the one that gave a lot of people the scares, was sectoral pay bargaining.
Yeah.
And then, of course, employment rights and protections from day one. So I'm going to ask you a slightly different, rather than just explaining those all over again, I'm going to ask you, what do you think the impact of those, maybe, go through them individually, the impact of those might be on A, recruiters' trading conditions, and then B, recruitment business owners, who, let's not forget, are employers as well. That's a really long question. Do you think you can start to address it, and then we'll fill in?
So shall I start with the nightmare? Yeah, I'll tell you what keeps me awake at night. What keeps me awake at night is the interconnection of one of the ones you didn't mention, the 0 hours contracts changes, with the day one unfair dismissal and the single employment status. So if all agency workers are employees and therefore have unfair dismissal rights, and they have a right after 12 weeks to a fixed contract, that sounds like the death knell of temporary recruitment in the United Kingdom. And I've said it in those terms to the Secretary of State. And the good thing is that there's a bit of an air war and a ground war here. The air war for us is our temp works campaign, where we're explaining why lots of workers actually want to work in a way that the unions think they don't, and getting that across. And I think the reason we went down that route is I think genuinely this government gets the economic value of what our industry does. They struggle. Angela Rayner said it to a group of our members in a meeting last year where we're doing our warm-up for this year. They struggle to see the social value sometimes. So that's why we're trying to talk in the voice of the worker. And I say all of that because the air war is all about this being more complex than maybe they came in thinking it is. You can see that in single employment status. You try and find it in the bill. It's not fair. It's already moving and moving and moving out and out and out. Because what is it? It's really complex.
Yes.
Look at the framing of it. It's now about who's a worker and who's self-employed. Well, actually, false self-employment is something we should think about. We're more concerned about aligning LIMBY workers with employees, the associated 0 hours. So I think the nightmare scenario is on our radar, but it's not immediately a problem. Because the employment status stuff has moved out. Right to switch off, I'm going to tell you now, don't worry about it. If it's anything, it's an ACAS code. You'll never be able to legislate for this. And frankly, if you are disturbing people on their days off at the point where a right to switch off code would become a problem for you, you're probably already harassing them. And at a level that none of us would want to do. So I think that can be written off as an immediate worry. The interesting one, sector pay agreements, is really interesting. It's really just care. And it will just be care in this Parliament. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the people who sign the checks for care in large part in this country live in the Treasury. And therefore, government is the core buyer of care services. It can drive the market up. The wider sectoral piece, and I cannot believe after years of hearing my union colleagues, I've been the UK representative at the International Labour Organization for Business for a few years, the CBI, and again last year. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but Convention 87 of the International Labour Organization requires that collective bargaining is done voluntarily by employers and trade unions. So when the Ardern government tried this in New Zealand, the business organizations largely said exactly what I will say to this government if they try it for agency workers. 2 words: get stuffed. There is no government can force employers to negotiate on pay in the private sector. It has to be voluntary, and that's not just what we want. That's international law. So there is so we need to worry a bit less about sectoral collective bargaining. It sounds great to the trade unions; they love it. The thing I'm never allowed to say in these meetings with us and the DPM and the unions around the table that I really want to say is the problem in Britain with collective bargaining and statutory union recognition is not with employers. You know, when workers join trade unions, employers will work with trade unions. It's actually persuading workers that unions is how they want to be represented in the private sector. So those things I'd write off a little bit. I do think day one is big. I do think it's big. I think for temp agencies, day one statutory sick pay is really big and unavoidable. It's a very clear manifesto commitment. They want sick pay from day one. That will clearly have a cost implication for negotiating in temp space.
Or would it have the implication that if someone goes off sick at the beginning of their temp assignment, will it just end up with the temp assignment being terminated?
Well, that might be the discussion that we are currently having.
Right.
So kind of,
Right.
how do you end an assignment in that scenario without the agency then being on the hook for all the sick pay? So there's a whole piece there that feels really important. Unfair dismissal feels like the one that could chill the market, but I think getting the 9-month qualifying period right, or the 9-month statutory probation period right, will help. And it's why actually the tone from lots of business voices on the bill is, let's just keep it calm, because really the animus between the government and business groups over the summer has been, why are we waiting till the end of October for the budget? Why are we waiting to mid-October for the industrial strategy? Why did you make that speech telling us it was all terrible at the end of August, which we can see in consumer sentiment? We need to turn it around. The example I've given to officials and ministers is that this £22 billion black hole that they have, £22 billion is 1.08% of government spending. If you're a recruiter in your business and you look at it and you go, oh, we're 1.08% off here, do you think I need to radically change what I'm doing, or do you think we can make that up with the right actions? So there's a whole piece here about let's just see that government spending is enormous. So 22 billion feels like a lot of money. It's actually, in the context of government spending, not that much, although it would, I wouldn't mind having it in a bank account. So there's kind of piece there about setting things in their proper context.
Yeah. That is all really helpful and valuable stuff. Thank you so much. And you heard it here, guys. Don't worry about sectoral pay bargaining, and the right to switch off is not high, and it's not the top of the agenda. Let's put it that way. And it's an interesting thing. I sometimes think when you hear MPs being interviewed and they talk about our flexible workforce, I think sometimes they think they're talking about people saying, yeah, you nip off early and I'll cover for you, or yeah, I'll take it, I'll work a bit late tonight. I think that's really what they think, instead of realizing that it's the UK temporary sector has been so successful in part because of worker status existing, isn't it?
I stole an example from in Pelham for this, and I use it all the time because it explains where we are now. In Pelham Phil, 3,500 shifts a week at Magna Park and Milton Keynes for John Lewis, August to December every year. 3,000 shifts a week at Magna Park, August to December every year, John Lewis Christmas. 10 years ago, they needed 3,500 candidates to do that because people are ill, people are taking a week off, all sorts of things, but 3,500 to fill 3,000 shifts. Everyone did 40 hours a week stably, and if they did it one week, they did it the next week. Now they need 12,500 people to fill those shifts because workers sit at home and they work it round dropping the kids off, they work it round caring responsibilities. I'll do that shift at John Lewis, but actually that shift over there pays more. I'll make time for doing that one with a different agency. And I think understanding the empowerment of the candidate now is a real drop back for politicians generally, but especially politicians who are coming into power having not been in power for 14 years, because it does look and feel fundamentally different to 2010. And that piece, I think we're doing a lot of education on right now. Talking about our restart program at the REC has placed 3,000 people out of long-term unemployment into jobs with members over the last 3 years. That scheme almost invariably is navigating people through some hurdles that they wouldn't jump over with a full-time open-ended job.
Yes, absolutely. Interesting point about trying to educate people about how the market has really changed, and my goodness, it has. I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, Neil. Do you think that these measures in the Employment Rights Bill, do you think that they will contribute towards the government's economic growth agenda, which they keep saying is their number one test? And all the business support quotes I'm reading on government websites, they're all from big business. Mm-hmm. And yet, as we know, the vast majority of businesses in the UK are not big. And I have got to admit, I'm a bit worried about them. We've had increases in corporation tax, added on pension contributions, increased employers' NICs. We've had another increase in minimum wage. Like, how much more can small businesses bear? So, yeah, what do you think this will actually help the growth agenda?
That is a really interesting question, which I'll unpick in a second. I'm very aware of the small business side as well, because one of the great joys of this whole process is the lead advocate for the Federation of Small Business, of course, is an REC member, Tina McKenzie, of Staffline. It's always good to have an Ulster voice in this as well, because worth remembering that Northern Ireland has devolved employment law and has a separate and potentially more challenging consultation that's just closed as well. That is a challenging question. Back in June on REC conference day, we got the chief execs of the biggest firms together with Delphine Strauss for the FT. And one of the things Delphine did was she put up the Labour manifesto promises and said, is that a problem? And to a man and woman, what they said is, no, if the economy is growing at 2.5% a year. So I think, yes, there is clearly a cost and a drag on business of adopting some of these changes. We need to be aware that actually, if you ask businesses which employment protection legislation they'd like to get rid of, the answer is usually tumbleweed, because if we get it right, it's important. I think the way you get to a neutral to hopefully positive growth impact is, one, you time the implementation, so it's not everything at once. Secondly, you properly enforce it so firms are not undercut. And then thirdly, you design the regulation to work with the way businesses do business, not against it. Ultimately, it is a cost, but the two underlying economic drivers, sorry, I'm going to get wonkish now. And I've got this far through and I haven't put my wonks hat on, so I'll allow myself to put it on now, and I'll warn you if I put it on again, Alice. One is, we do need clients to think more strategically about people. One of the things I'm pushing really hard in government is not to just have a lateral across the industrial strategy called skills, because skills sounds like what the DFE will fund. And as long as they fund some stuff and some people sit on seats in colleges, everything will be fine. Right. Actually, it should be workforce and productivity. So when we get into workforce and productivity, we need companies to lean in. And the mayors have done brilliantly on this in England, actually, in Manchester and Birmingham, into thinking more strategically about, what am I going to buy? What am I going to borrow? What am I going to grow? And there's a great opportunity for us in the industry to be the experts there. We've been hauled in by West Midlands before the mayoral election because they needed recruiters in the room. Andy Burnham sat down a couple of years ago at a meeting with REC members of Manchester, said, I'm glad you're here because you are exactly the people I need. So there's a big market opportunity to be in that advisory shaping space of buy, borrow, grow. And to an extent, if these changes just nudge firms to think about a more sustainable approach to how they hire, that would be good. And if they encourage firms to think more sustainably about how they deploy people for productivity, that would also be good. So it's not that the seesaw is completely on the this is cost side. If we get it right, there are potentially some benefits, but I see a lot of cost. And I am worried about that in the context of the current growth environment. Running a business in Britain in the last 2 years has been hard. Running a small business has been harder still. So it always slightly sticks in the craw to sit in a room, as I did on Tuesday, and listen to Mick Lynch tell us that British business have had it all their own way for the last 14 years, and now they had to suck it up a bit. Well, thanks very much, Mick. Your vast experience of the private sector really showing there.
Yes.
From my perspective, I talk to a lot of small businesses that have had a tough time. And actually, they do believe in this stuff. They do believe in treating people well. So it's practicalities. It's how do you on-ramp it smoothly, get the design right, do it over time, and then hopefully get some of those upside benefits. I think I think the risks are on the downside. If we get it wrong, it could be growth negative. But if we get it
Yes.
right, it could be marginally growth positive. But I think the money might flow to some people we want spending money, the workforce. Britain is a consumer economy.
Right. Yes, it's important to see this in the broader context, isn't it? And there are often unintended consequences of new legislation
Yes.
that come about. But I know that the recruitment business owners that I work with try very, very hard to be good bosses to their staff.
Absolutely.
And what does hack them off, you already alluded to it, is when they see the bad guys getting away with not doing the same, following the same regulations. So is there anything at the moment on how these new regulations are likely to be enforced?
Well, I refer the Honourable Lady to the FT of Friday the 4th of October, where the Chief Executive of the RAC was out with all his fangs out on this one.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not going to enforce the law, what's the point of the law?
Mm-hmm.
And we live there now, okay? Not too much of what we've got now isn't properly enforced.
Yes.
And this has been a challenge for some time, and there are risks here, right? EAS, the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, is full of really good people who are really skilled in understanding our industry. As we offer them up to this Fair Work Agency, I do not want not to have people who are specialists in understanding employment agencies.
Mm.
At the same time, I want that new agency to be effective, because anything that undercuts, we see it, don't we? So the classic one would be firm cuts corners, starts to set the reference price in a market. Clients react to that reference price and expect good companies to match it.
Mm-hmm.
Good companies don't match it. Candidates move,
Mm-hmm.
and desks follow. And over the course of it, the whole market levels down. We've seen that in some sectors.
Mm.
I think government's got to address some fairly obvious holes. I mean, I don't know whether I have to paint regulate umbrella companies in letters 600 feet high down Whitehall, but every conversation we have is, if you went down the route with IR35, you're going down this route with worker status, you have to close off and level the regulation playing field. Employment businesses are regulated by the Act, they're regulated by the conduct regs, they're regulated by the agency workers regs. All we're asking for is a level playing field. The FWA has a potential to do that. The one thing I said,
Sorry, the FWA.
the Fair Work Agency. This is what this thing has been branded as.
Yeah.
It's in the bill, so it's coming. It's going to bring together a number of areas. I think bringing it together is right, but I think it has to resource enforcement.
Okay.
One of the conversations we're having with ministers is, you can't talk big employment rights and then not follow through on funding the enforcement of those rights. And that means shortening employment tribunal wait times. And it means a proper enforcement agency. My suggestion to them has been, just like we did with the Low Pay Commission and National Minimum Wage and the Health and Safety Commission when the HSE was introduced, this is something that actually you need to hand the steering wheel over to business and unions on. I would prefer that the Fair Work Agency was guided by a body like the ACAS Council that I sit on for ACAS, where the predominant voices are practitioners in the field, other than government, because I think that will help it be effective. Long way to go on that, though. The powers in the bill are just frameworks, but yeah, that enforcement discussion is there. And one of the reasons I pushed it in the FT the other Friday was I felt that we were doing all of our time talking about what laws will change. We need to make it easier to be compliant and more difficult to be non-compliant. And the more we do that, the more we will see things change. The great thing about the national minimum wage when it was introduced in a way where businesses and It was simple. Businesses and unions knew what the rate was. It was £3.60. And if you saw someone who wasn't paying £3.60, you knew it was wrong and you could just point the finger at them. That's the way life should be more generally. You don't want people turning up to do endless inspections of the books. It's about when there's evidence, an agency that can take action.
You just an interesting footnote, what you said there, that a lot of people aren't aware of this, but Easy, the Employment Agencies Inspectorate, has staffed up big time, hasn't it?
The whole of that team has the employment rights team in the Department for Business is treble the size it was before the summer. I think we are. I will say this, and apologies to those who've had a more challenging inspection recently. I'm a huge fan of Ben Bruton and the team at EAS. I think actually we're very lucky to have people who are as committed to understanding our industry as they are. And go back to what we were talking about inside government. Inside government, Ben is a fantastic advocate for how regulation can be made navigable for agencies. I remember working with him closely where you'll remember the Regulation 7 and striking workers nonsense that we went through. I think Ben's insight and voice inside government on that was incredibly helpful.
Thank you. Now, you've already answered my next question, which was going to be, are there any areas that in recruitment that you think should be more regulated? And you've already said regulate umbrella companies. So as we're running out of time, my final question. You speak to a lot of your opposite numbers and other associated recruitment leaders around the world. So how, given that this is probably the most densely supplied recruitment market in the world is in the UK.
Yes.
Not necessarily that it's not the biggest. The US is the biggest and Japan is number 2. I think is that up to date? Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
But in terms of, dense supply, i.e. multiple recruitment agencies, we hold the record.
Absolutely.
Do we need a market correction? And if so, what might that look like?
So I often kind of use the example of my good friends at Asso Lavoro in Italy. And they have 130 agencies.
And this is a parallel to the REC.
A parallel to the REC in Italy.
They have 130.
And that's not their membership.
Oh.
That's all of the agencies.
Right.
So
don't tell me, are they all in Milan as well?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. No, that might be going a bit far. If I look at our data, and people talk about 30,000, that's not true. There's lots of single-handers doing kind of little bits of executive search or things in the supply chain. We think there's about 10,000 substantive businesses that you would call an employment business or an employment agency in the United Kingdom, based on our analysis of Dun & Bradstreet data. That is a lot per capita.
Right.
And it is one of the things that feeds the fact that this is the thinnest margined market in the world. Some of that is about client understanding of what we do. And the margins are fatter in Europe and they're fatter in the United States, and that suggests that we are the most competitive market. Will there be a correction? I think the gentle correction has been happening for years. We are seeing coalescing. I think technology and the scale that you need means that small businesses will increasingly be clear niche businesses, and larger businesses will be more general and be deploying a lot more in the way of technology. I'm a great fan of our sector. I'm paid to be, but I was with Bev White, the chief exec of Nash Squared, earlier in the week, and she had just come back from doing an event with NASA in New York. Standard Bearer, a British company, talking about tech skills with NASA in New York. The view in the US is if you can make money in British recruitment, you can do it anywhere. We should be a bit proud of the market that we have. It's innovative, it's really strong. I think over time we're moving to probably a net smaller number of agencies overall. That's what our recruitment industry status report is saying. But I don't think it's I don't think it's a kind of a mass shift. And I think agencies have the potential to cross the bridge to where we're going. I was talking at the Expo recently about this. If they are thinking about what their product is and how they create value, and that being more than just fulfillment. Go back to helping your clients navigate that buy, borrow, build triangle. Think about help them thinking about their people supply chain. There is a space here where we're always going to compete on good fulfillment, but we'll also compete on solving clients' pain points. And I think the businesses who do that will make it in this market. And I potentially think that there are tailwinds for margins in the UK starting to increase, particularly driven by the fact that the labour market is going to be structurally tight for the next 25 years. We got used to having quite a large labour force, largely driven by the baby boomers. Now we've reversed that. The domestic labour force is getting smaller every year. The skills needs are changing faster and faster. I think actually there's an opportunity here to build really great businesses. You'd expect me to say this as Chief Executive of the REC, but I am nothing but optimistic about the value our industry creates and where we're going.
That's a brilliant place to end. Neil, it has been an absolute eye-opener and a pleasure to have you as a guest on the Recruitment Leadership Podcast.
Anytime, Alison, anytime.
Thank you so much for that. We're releasing this one very quickly, so things may move on, and in which case I'll be taking you up on that anytime. Thank you very much. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in, if that's an acceptable phrase. Once again, to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast, this is Alison Humphreys. Thanks. Goodbye.
You've been listening to the Recruitment Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, review, and share so that others can find the podcast too. We really appreciate your support. If you have any questions about the topics covered or wish to find out more about recruitment leadership, please email alison@recruitmentleadership.co.uk, referencing the podcast. We're also on LinkedIn, where you can follow Recruitment Leadership and connect with Alison Humphreys. Thank you for listening, and we hope you join us next time for another episode of the Recruitment Leadership Podcast.